All right, so thank you everyone for attending our event, Cuba, What's Next? I am Ashley Runlet. I am Assistant Professor of Political Science at the University of Rhode Island. So we have three great panelists today. They're each going to give a 10 to 15 minute presentation. After the presentations, we will have a question and answer period. So we encourage everyone to submit their questions using the Q&A feature, and our moderator, Frank Martinez, will choose questions for the panelists to answer. So before I do hand it over to our moderator, I would also like to thank the College of Arts and Sciences for their continued support of many events, including this one. So I would now like to introduce our moderator and panel organizer, Frank Martinez. He is one of our esteemed graduate students in international relations with a concentration in diplomacy. He will be finishing up his master's this semester. And before he joined us here at URI, he graduated from the University of Havana with a Bachelor of Science in Economics. He completed a graduate fellowship at Georgetown University, and he is also a board member of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. So without further ado, Frank Martinez.
Thank you, Ashley, for the introduction. I'm really happy to be here today, and thanks to the University of Rhode Island ASCII for planning this event and for the excellent panelists that we have today. I want to thank Silvia, Vadim, and Luis for being here today with us. At the end of the presentations, we will have a time for a Q&A session. Please feel free to send us your presentation. Our first guest is Silvia Pedraza. Silvia Pedraza is a professor of sociology and American culture at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor. Her research interests include the sociology of migration, race, ethnicity in America, as well as the sociology of Cuban Revolution and Exodus. Her research seeks to understand the causes and consequences of immigration as an historical process that form and transform nations. She's an author of several books, including Political Disaffections in Cuban Revolution and Exodus, and have a forthcoming book of revolutions in Cuba and Venezuela, One Hope, Two Realities. She's a former president of ASCII. Silvia, and welcome to our event, and I pass it on to you.
Okay, let us hope that everything goes well with the screen share. All right. Sorry, from the beginning. Okay, hopefully. Okay, so this is what I'm going to talk about today, the contemporary crises that are taking place in Cuba. Okay. There's a number of sources that I will go through in this presentation. One is that Cuba has now a dismal economy. This is a phrase from Carmelo Mesalago's work. It also has a very old population, the oldest in the Western Hemisphere. It's also a very old revolution, 63 years old, and that means that there is a crisis of political legitimacy. The exodus has never ceased. In recent years, it has particularly drawn from very young people, which is problematic. And there is a lot of growing inequality in Cuba, both of social class and particularly of race. There's also a troubled relationship with Venezuela now, an alliance, and its relationship with the United States. So there is a lot of sources of crises that are taking place in Cuba, and I will take these one at a time. Okay, the first is that there is a dismal economy, okay? As we know, what is called the special period after a speech from Fidel Castro when the Soviet Union and the Eastern European communist world collapsed, and that of course sent Cuba into an economic tailspin, and GDP contracted by 35% in just a few years, which resulted in enormous hunger and health problems within the island. And the reason it's called a special period is because Fidel Castro, with his enormous capacity for discourse and oratory, called it a special period in a time of peace. And ever since then, it has become known as the special period. This special period, which was an enormous crisis, economic and social in Cuban society, particularly manifested itself in the crisis of the balseros, the rafters, that left Cuba in massive numbers, 36,000 people in the summer of 1994. These are just some photos of the special period. Those of us who managed to visit the island during those years did often see this type of scenario where people were pushing the cars for them to start up or push them for them to start down. And the lack of food in the bodegas that belong to the government, advertisements, but nothing in the libreta, really. This crisis then prompted Raúl Castro from 2006 to 2012 to engage in market-oriented reforms. The new president, after Fidel Castro passed away, increased tourism, self-employment, which in Cuba is called cuentapropismo, and joint ventures with foreigners, particularly with respect to the tourist industry, such as very good hotels that were built together with Spain, the Malia chain of hotels. But some folks in ASCI, Association for the Study of the Cuban Society and Economy, such as Carmelo Mesalago and Jorge Perez Lopez, who have studied these reforms, still think that the reforms were too timid, because they still very much come out of a very inefficient model of centralized planning, state enterprises, and control of agriculture. There are still too many restrictions for the small private sector of the economy to be able to really grow and develop. There's taxes, there's other disincentives. So there is a growing amount of cuentapropismo, but there could be a great deal more if the restrictions were not in place. Moreover, Cuba used to be known for its sugar industry. I know that in the 19th century, people in Cuba said, without sugar, there is no country, But now there is in fact no sugar, Since 1989, the beginning of the special period, at present, the sugar output is 82% below 1989, So in fact, Cuba is producing sugar at levels of the 19th century. So recent economic trends, and again, these are very recent, and the data comes from Cuba's Statistical Office, Oficina Nacional de Estadísticas e Información, ONE, and CEPAL, the Economic Commission for Latin America of the United Nations. And you can see that in very recent years, in 2006, Cuba's growth in GDP was 12.1%. Then it declined by 2009, just 3 years later, to 1.4%. In 2017, it was 1.8%. In 2019, 1%. And in 2020, according to CEPAL's estimate, it's minus 8%. Other economists put the estimate even higher. What it says is it's a declining economy. It's a contracted economy. So there is a total reliance on tourism now. In effect, nothing else. There is no longer any sugar. And what I think happens then, if you rely on only one thing, whether it's sugar or tourism, is that you are a monoculture. And so your fate in the world, in the economy, goes up and down with that particular industry. And so Cuba needs desperately, I think, to diversify its economy. It always has needed to diversify its economy, and relying only on tourism, you can imagine at a time like now with the COVID crisis, is really, really problematic. So very recently, the government now, after Raúl Castro, the new president is Miguel Díaz-Canel, the latest reforms are called de ordenamiento, And that has involved a currency reform that just took place. So the CUC, the old convertible pesos that were in place for many, many years, disappeared overnight. And now Cuba is back to only one currency, the peso. That is probably a good reform, but it has been very drastic, and the price rises have been enormous. La libreta, the rationing book from which people used to be able to eat, at least to rely, never to eat well, but at least to be able to rely on it, has continued to decline and decline. There's very little on La Libreta now. A much better thing, I think, is that the internet is now being widely used, and most Cubans have cell phones, or at least a cell phone in the family. So it's a shared cell phone, but they increasingly are part of the modern world, which I think is very positive. Also, now people begin to buy and to sell homes, as opposed to just in the past where they were exchanging homes, and it was called permutar. And it's also positive, I think, that people are much freer to travel out of the country and also return. Okay, the work of Albert O. Hirschman and his student, Victor Perez Diaz. Victor Perez Diaz has come up with a notion of democratic apprenticeship. He thinks when he studied, for example, the Spanish exodus of working class people to Germany to work in Germany for many years, and they returned back to Spain, that they had undergone a democratic apprenticeship while they were living and working in Germany, and they returned with those influences to Spain. So I do also see the travel in and out of the country at present as also something very positive. So there's, you know, some good things going on, but there is a lot of crises. Another problem in Cuban society is that the population is now very old, okay? And this is what happens when there is a very low birth rate that has been sustained for many, many years, okay? The Cuban birth rate was already very low in the 1950s in comparison to other countries in Latin America with similar cultural, religious backgrounds. It became particularly low during the years of the revolution because there was so much hardship and so much want. And many people thought that they couldn't bring a child into the world under those circumstances. At least my family tells me that one of my dear cousins almost didn't arrive, but they decided to go with it. The result is that now Cuba has the oldest population in the Western Hemisphere, which also means that, you know, the working age people need to support both the very young and the very old. And the pensions of the elderly are so small that, in fact, the elderly cannot live on their own. They're forced to live with their family. That sometimes works out very well. It does in the case of my family, but sometimes it doesn't. So it's also the case that after 63 years, the revolution itself is an old revolution. Okay. And that means that there is inside of the revolution a crisis of political legitimacy. Okay, Fidel Castro, as we all know, was, you know, one of the great charismatic leaders of history. His leadership, I think, was messianic, you know, and that's certainly not the case with Raúl. Castro has had a very different persona to him, mostly the persona, I think, of a reformer. And now he's followed by Díaz-Canel. And we don't know very much yet about Díaz-Canel because, as he said on the day when he was inaugurated, he is continuing with the past, and the major decisions, he said, would still be taken by Raúl Castro. Okay, I think in recent years also, the dissident movement that has been there for a very long time has continued to grow, has continued to expand. We continue to see Las Damas de Blanco every Sunday walking all over Havana. UNPACO, the Unión Nacional Patriótica de Cuba, has also become larger. And as a result, the repression has also increased. Okay, so there is an old dissident movement that continues to expand at enormous cost. Okay, this all resulted in a new constitution in 2018 and the appointment of a new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. But as I said, his policies so far, he stressed, would be a continuation of the past. However, he does seem to have engaged in currency reform. And so we hope for more reforms in the future. This is just a photograph of Raúl Castro together with Miguel Díaz-Canel wearing this is a beloved outfit for Cuban men, and that is the white guayabera. Okay, so I think that increasingly we have also seen demands from the people for real democratization. Just last November 27th, not very long ago, we saw the unprecedented social protests that took place by the San Isidro movement, together with manifestations led by artists, young artists and intellectuals in Havana. And what they were demanding and asking for was a real dialogue, freedom of association, freedom of expression, real political participation, and real political representation. And here's a photograph of the San Isidro social movement, young people mostly in front of the Minister of Culture. The government did not respond well to this. I think that they should listen more than they do, but they didn't. They called them mercenaries. And that is an unfair thing to call people who have no other connections than themselves and who are asking for changes as young Cuban citizens. So it is an old revolution, and to me that means that it is marked by very different political generations, okay? A political generation is a concept that comes from the work of Karl Mannheim in the 1950s, a Jewish German sociologist. And basically what it says is that the years in which one goes from being an adolescent to being an adult, in that transition, if there are very dramatic historical events that take place at that time, that generation is marked with a certain set of attitudes, of political attitudes that tend to be with them for the rest of their lives. So that's the concept of political generations. So here I contrast two at the two extremes, okay? One is the generation born during the special period, the young, and I called that in my work the generation of disbelief, because to them, most of the time, the glorious revolution has only been a story that they have been told repeatedly at home, in school, in television, in movies. But the truth of their lives is that they have only known a lot of problems, a lot of want, a lot of poverty. And unfortunately, many of them want to leave the island. This is very different than the generation of the glorious revolution, the people that were there at the time of the birth of the revolution, who fought for it, who sacrificed for it, and they're now old. I mean, a little older than I, but they're still in power, okay? And they cling still in their attitudes to what is best in the revolution, to the spread of literacy and public health across the island for everyone. But at the same time, they never become responsible for its problems. They always blame the US embargo for everything that goes wrong. Not to say that the US embargo isn't responsible for a lot of what is wrong in Cuban society, but it is also important that the government and that generation take responsibility, accountability for the problems in Cuban society, and in general, they don't. Okay, there's still an exodus, okay? The Cuban exodus has really never ceased. It began with the beginning of the revolution. It has taken several shapes and forms over time, different waves, as we like to talk about immigrants in immigrant studies, but it has continued, okay? And now it's very widely spread. It doesn't come just to the United States, but to all of Latin America, to Spain, to Canada, to Europe. And in general, the UNI statistics tell us that about 20% of the Cuban population left. Overwhelmingly, it is the exodus of people who are young, people who no longer believe that there is a future for them in their lives in Cuba. Some of them are my family, and I regret it, okay? And I think it's problematic also, not only because young people are the future of the country, but also because it's they that provide the leadership of social movements, okay? At the same time, the new exodus that has taken place in recent years is different than the old exodus that many of us come from, in that people now leave Cuba temporarily and sometimes return, okay? So that there's not a total break with the past always. Sometimes there is, but sometimes there isn't, okay? If they return, as I was talking about before, they have the possibility of bringing back a democratic apprenticeship. Everyone that has been to Cuba in recent years has noticed the growing inequality, okay? During the years when the Soviet Union was the benefactor, the dominant presence in Cuban society, inequality in Cuba was very little. Nobody had anything, as people tell me on the island, but then again, nobody had anything. But in recent years, with all the reforms that have taken place, inequality has risen, particularly of social class and race, okay? Part of the reason for the growing inequality is the remittances, okay? Remittances are the money that those who emigrated sent back to their family and their friends, okay? And because the Cuban exodus for many, many years, and particularly in the early stages of the revolution, drew from the white part of the Cuban population and not so much from Black Cubans, then remittances now from those in exile go to white Cubans and not to Black Cubans, okay? But that's not the only source of inequality. The other source of racial inequality is that for many years now, there has in fact been a policy of having the tourist sector, the people who serve in the tourist sector come mostly from the white Cuban population and not from the Black Cuban population, which is also very problematic because that is this tourism is the source of a dollar, an euro, and Black Cubans have very little access to the job opportunities that exist in the tourist sector, okay? In addition, in recent years, due to changes in the way that colleges, universities admit students, most of the population of students in the university are now disproportionately white. Okay, so there are many sources of growing inequality in Cuban society. And at the same time, there has been a decline in the quality of social services in education and in public health. And this is in part due to, we all know that in recent years, Cuba has been exporting thousands of doctors to Venezuela, a result of the alliance between Cuba and Venezuela, in which Hugo Chávez started a program of assistance to the poorest people of Venezuela in shanty towns and in rural areas with the help of thousands and thousands of Cuban doctors. At its peak, it involved 50,000 Cuban doctors. I mean, this is not a little international mission to Nicaragua or to the Seychelles Islands where you send 55 people after an earthquake. This is a very massive export of doctors, 50,000 at its peak. At present, because that alliance has also been declining, at present it's probably up to 22,000 people, okay? Many people in Venezuela, old Venezuelan doctors actually are resentful of these new doctors that have come in, taking over some of their jobs. The alliance with Venezuela, it has been formidable, okay? Doctors have been traded for oil, as I was just talking about Hugo Chávez, Barrio Adentro, and the enormous number of Cuban doctors that came to Venezuela to work there. But Venezuela is in exchange for oil, okay? But Venezuela is now caught in a spiral of its own economic and political crises, and its assistance is declining and cannot be counted upon. So here, this is a wonderful photo that I found in Google Images. And this is where, this is the type of photo that the Chinese say one image is worth 10,000 words, because it says that both Hugo Chávez and Fidel Castro saw themselves as tied to one another, and they planned to succeed or fail, but certainly to succeed together. Here's some data from Venezuela's oil shipments to Cuba. This is Venezuelan data. And it says that in 2000 to 2012, it was about 100,000 barrels a day. Cuba's electricity in the whole island depends on these oil shipments. So I can assure you that the apagones, as people call them in Cuba, when they lose all the lights due to the fact that they lost the electricity, they were very, very, very common prior to 2000. They became far less common when all these 1,000 barrels of oil arrived a day. Cubans have a joke that in Cuba, you don't have apagones, what you have is alumbrones, meaning that it's not that the electricity goes out, it's that it occasionally comes on, But nonetheless, the fact is that recently the number of barrels of oil a day have really been steeply declining, and they cannot be expected to go back up. Here is a photo that I myself took, and I'm very proud of it because little did I expect to take it. This is a Venezuelan ship bringing in oil as it enters Havana. And here is the Christ of Havana, okay? I happened on this trip a few years ago to be with my very good friend, Padre Mario Delgado. We were on our way to seeing La Virgen de Regla, and we had to catch a little boat to go Casablanca to go to Regla to see that shrine of that beautiful virgin that is a black virgin holding a white child. And as we were on our way there, we saw this enormous ship arriving. And I can assure you that the Christ of Havana is not small. So this is very large, okay? And that's, you know, I know that I said a little prayer inside of me at that time. Okay, US-Cuba relations, okay. In recent years, we had the restoration of diplomatic relations under Obama. Beginning, it was announced in December 14th, and it finally took place in July of 2015. I was glued to the television on July 2015 when it took place just in front of the university, the embassy, the American embassy in Havana. It was a very beautiful day, sunny with a blue sky, and the same young Marines, or Marines who had been young 54 years earlier, who had taken down the flag when the United States broke relations, and Cuba broke relations also with the United States. They took down the flag of the United States, and the embassy, as an embassy, was closed, and it became the intersection. And those same Marines who were now 54 years older and no longer looking as fit as a young Marine usually looks, they were there. And they handed that old flag that had been folded for 54 years to the young Marines whose job it was now to protect the embassy in Havana. And it was actually a little difficult for the flag to open. It had been folded for 54 years. And I wondered if it was going to open, and all of a sudden it unfurled. And as it unfurled, I have to say that I had tears coming down my eyes because it was so moving to me as a moment. Okay. One of its many results was that there was thereafter an avalanche of tourism from the United States to Cuba, people who had not been able to go for so many years and really wanted to see Cuba and what Cuba was like. And during those years, about 4 to 5 million tourists went to Cuba every year. Okay. But that period didn't last very long because it started in, Obama's second term, halfway through the second term. And pretty soon we had a new president, Donald Trump, whose idea of the best relationship to have with Cuba was completely contrary. And so he undid many of Obama's reforms, not only with respect to Cuba, but also with respect to a lot of other things that he could get his hands on. And he issued a lot of sanctions, okay? And the sanctions were, again, the sort of hardline type of sanctions that are intended to isolate Cuba, very punitive. I personally do not agree with them. Other people in the Cuban American exile community may, but I always make the point that I don't. And I find them to be counterproductive rather than pushing Cuba to become more democratic. They push Cuba to become more totalitarian. So the new sanctions. Among them were the fact that the cruises traveling to Cuba came to an end. It ended the people-to-people travel and visas that had been in place since Bill Clinton. It ended most regular airline flights to Cuba, to cities other than Havana. And then together with the COVID-19 crisis, this has in effect resulted in the disappearance of tourism, which is the only income-generating industry that Cuba has. And it has had an enormous impact on the small businesses, which were also very much tied to the tourist industry. Among the many reforms, the last one that I'm still regretting is that he closed Western Union at a time when there's also not people going from here to there, so that sending help to one's family has become very problematic. I'm still working on it. So Cuba, what is next? Okay. I have been speaking about a lot of different crises, and I want to say something about how I see a crisis, okay? Everybody that knows me knows that when I use the word crisis, I usually refer to it in the sense in which the Chinese have been so explicit, and that is that in Chinese, the word crisis is spelled with 2 characters. One character means danger, it certainly is a moment of danger, and the other character means opportunity, okay? In my view, and it's my personal view, is that only if the Cuban government truly listens to its people and tries to incorporate their ideas and their dissent, Only if it really allows them to participate in the political life can the moment of danger be turned into a moment of opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Silvia. You could now stop sharing the screen, and I will introduce our next panelist, Luis. Thank you. Luis is an international economist based in Massachusetts, specialized in international finance. He has long been involved in international finance and investment as an official of international organizations, commercial banks, and investment management companies. Luis is a member of ASCII since its foundation. He has a PhD degree in economics from the University of Notre Dame and have lectured at universities in the US, Europe, and South America. Thank you, Luis, for being with us today here. You could take over now.
Okay, thank you, Frank, and thank you very much to the University of Rhode Island for the kind invitation to join this panel. And let me start by sharing my PowerPoint. So the title of my presentation is essentially dealing with the recent major economic developments in Cuba, and I call it dollar crunch, which means scarcity of dollars in the economy, the massive devaluation that the economy just is undertaking, and the reforms of the monetary system that, as Silvia mentioned, is called in Cuba ordenamiento monetario, or monetary ordering. So as an introduction, and I think Silvia already mentioned some of the elements, but in terms of economics, in the last decade, Cuba has faced two major economic policy problems. One is large distortions caused by a rigid two-currency system, which means there was a vast disparity involving huge subsidies between people who were able to transact in one currency or in the other. The official difference in the rates between the Cuban peso, or CUP, and the Cuban convertible peso, or CUC, was 2,300%. So essentially, if you were able to import at one currency exchange rate, and not at the official rate of the second currency, you were getting a massive subsidy. This is a huge distortion, which essentially made exports a big problem. The second problem was the structural problems in the balance of payments. They were linked to the first question, and it had to do with essentially the collapse of exports in Cuba going back 20 years, and steadily in the last decade we could see that. Now, on January 1st, the two currencies were merged, and a major devaluation, and this is really a major devaluation, I will talk about it later, took place. Now, some of the questions I will try to explain are, why is there a dollar crunch in Cuba? And the main reason is that export revenues are essentially have been dwindling, and also subsidies from Venezuela, which were huge. At one point, Venezuela, at the peak point around 2013, Venezuela was transferring 7% of Cuba's GDP every year to Cuba in terms of subsidies and cash transfers. And that essentially has dwindled to 1% of GDP, of Cuban GDP. Now, why is there dollarization? Dollarization means that the population uses a dollar or some hard currency, the euro, for instance, in order to do some transactions and as a store of value. And it usually takes place because there are controls or because there's a fear that the local currency will depreciate. Now, the devaluation is very important because Cuba depends on imports for most of its foodstuffs and medical goods and other essential goods, so that expectations as to what these goods will cost to Cubans depends on the expectations of the movement of the peso, the exchange rate. Now, the monetary reform has begun to take place, and this involves also a reform of the subsidy system, but we have the consequence result of inflation. And I call this the Big Bang. Big Bang is the devaluation and the monetary expansion that comes with it. The little bang is the slow pace of some reforms that need to be done. Now, to look at the data, we can look at recent imports and exports, and you can see the crisis here. Imports go down from about $700 million per month to around 300. This is the last data available as of April of last year. And undoubtedly, it may have gone down a bit more in the last part of 2020. So this is essentially at the red line where Cuba is now suffering major scarcity of foodstuffs, medicines, and other essential items. Now, interestingly enough, exports have declined. These are goods exports. It doesn't include tourism, which is the major source of export revenue. But these are only merchandise exports. They've declined, but not as much. And actually, nickel prices, for instance, which is the main commodity that Cuba exports now, have really gone up in the second half of 2020. So this is a crisis of tourism caused by the pandemic. The pandemic has aggravated tremendously the situation, and also by the massive decline in subsidies from Venezuela. Now, the policies of the Trump administration also have something to do with this. It began hitting tourism in 2018 and 2019, but the pandemic has now essentially completely stopped tourism from Europe, Canada, and other places, so it has aggravated the situation. Another way to look at it is Cuban assets, which are usually reserves, but we don't know what Cuba's reserves are, since they are not published, but we can look at Cuban banks' assets outside of Cuba, which are published by the Bank for International Settlements, and now they've gone down from about 4,000 million, in other words, 4 billion, to around 2 billion since 2010, although there was a recovery around this time when Cuba was able to renegotiate its debts and was able to also get a boost in tourism following the improvement of U.S.-Cuba relations, but now it has declined. This data is as of the end of September of last year. So dollar crunch. Well, imports declined 51% in the first quarter of 2020. And the government has stated officially that there was a 45% shortfall of its budgeted foreign exchange earnings in 2020. That matches the data that I have. And it's in the ballpark, it's around 45–50% shortfall. It's a huge shortfall. By the end of last year, the imports of food and medicines were close to the red line, where the country was on the verge of having really a very drastic shortage of foodstuffs. And it's not only foodstuffs. Cuba must import, in order to produce local food, it must import seeds and fertilizers and pesticides, and those have also been curtailed. So the consequence is that the domestic production of foodstuffs has really gone down. Rice production has gone down by over 30%. For instance, rice is the main staple of the Cuban diet. Now, restrictions on tourism due to COVID-19 are continuing so far in this year. Now, the Cuban peso at the end of the year traded at 30 to 45 per dollar in the black market, and the official rate was 24. Right now, today we can get in the internet quotes of about 50 per dollar. So I'm trying to explain what happens in Cuba, what economists call the currency substitution model. I'm not going to get into details, technical details about this, but I used it because it applied to this very strange economy that had three currencies, essentially, the Cuban peso, the Cuban convertible peso, and the dollar. And again, the mechanics is that the people in Cuba, even though it's a planned economy, individuals choose, and they can choose where they hold dollars or pesos or convertible pesos. The dollars come from exports and, very importantly, from remittances. In other words, these are remittances from the US mostly. Around 90% of remittances to Cuba come from the United States, the rest from Spain and Canada mostly. And this model understands, helps us understand dollarization and what happens to the exchange rate. And this is all very important because, as I explained, people look at the exchange rate, and that is a gauge of future inflation, which is now a key problem. Now, my model, I'm again not going to get into a lot of details, but I can look at the model by looking at the exchange rate. This is like pesos per dollar, and these are dollar holdings by the population. Last year, before the pandemic, we would get a position of the economy at some equilibrium rate of exchange and this amount of dollar holdings. When the pandemic came, this curve shows essentially the supply of dollars. It's the balance in the current account of the balance of payments. This moves up, meaning there are fewer dollars at a given exchange rate, and this equilibrium rate moves up here. This is what happens. It moved from around 25 to 40, essentially in the black market, indicating this is what the economy was experiencing. And the interesting thing is that there are fewer dollars going into Cuba, so the paradox, and this is difficult to see, is that there are fewer dollars coming in. So the economy is being dollarized with fewer dollars. Now, in terms of local value of the dollars, the way this model is done, the value of the dollars in peso terms is higher in this particular example. So this is the paradox of dollarization. The dollar becomes king. There are fewer dollars because tourism has collapsed. Remittances have gone down also because of the US pandemic and because of restrictions by the Trump administration. Now, what happens with the merger of the currencies, I'm not going to get into a lot of details, but last year and for many years, we had the two currencies, which are represented by the blue and red curves. They merge on January 1st, and we have a new equilibrium curve here of exchange rates, and this is the supply of pesos, M. So essentially, there's a big bang. There's a huge money expansion in Cuba to accommodate the new situation. What happens is that the actual new rate, official rate, is below what may be an equilibrium rate, which has to be on this curve. So the economy is around a point around here. Money is expanding very rapidly. And essentially, the black market is telling us the equilibrium rate is up here. So we have still a situation of distortions. Now, what devaluation is taking place is being a huge devaluation. This has been a very long overdue reform that all economists in Cuba have been recommending, and outside of Cuba that understand the economy and study the economy have been recommending. So it was long overdue. The government has been announcing this will take place for many years, since at least 2012. Now, the devaluation is a huge development. The devaluation is about 6 times. In other words, about 500% based on an average I calculated of transactions for production from about 4 per dollar to 24. Now, to give you a sense of how large this is, students of international economics look at the devaluation of the British pound in 1967, which was 14% as a huge event that shook the UK's economy. This one was 500%. And actually calculations by other economists show a higher devaluation when they look at consumption, because consumption in Cuba is essentially driven by imports. So if you look at consumption, I'm looking at production here, the devaluation was 6 times looking at production weights. But if you look at consumption weights, which is what affects the people, the devaluation was around 10 times, according to Pavel Vidal, a very prominent Cuban economist. And that's about right. So this is a major event which causes all kinds of side effects. It's a kind of medicine that you need to take, but which has very severe secondary effects. Now, in order to protect the population, the government increased wages around 5.5 times in terms of the minimum wages, and many other wages by around 5 times, and also increased to reduce subsidies in the economy, increase the price of services and government products in stores. So the government projects revenues are up around 5.2 times and expenditures 4.9 times. So some reduction in net subsidies. But subsidies will still remain because elimination of subsidies will imply that state companies will have to fire people and create unemployment, a severe unemployment problem. So we expect the continuation of subsidies, even though presumably they are going down. Now, the resulting subsidies will mean that they will have to be financed by a monetary expansion. And this will, even after the initial huge devaluation, will feed essentially price pressures. So inflation will be a severe problem, and is a severe problem now. The government itself estimates that their budget deficit this year will be about 18% of GDP, which is a huge number, and provide a difficult environment for inflation. Now, because of the dollar scarcity, the shortages of food and essential products are likely to continue. Now, what do I mean by devaluation of the current account? Devaluations are undertaking almost always because there is a need to improve essentially the trade balance. The current account is the overall trade balance. So the Cuba has a problem in making this work. So it's paying the cost. The cost of the devaluation is inflation, which affects the poor more than the wealthier portion of the population. But Cuba has what we call inelastic exports and imports, which means that they're not responsible very much to devaluations. And why is that? Well, in the case of imports, because they constitute largely essential goods like foodstuffs and medicines and inputs for agriculture. In the case of exports, there haven't been sufficient investments in the export sectors like in nickel plants and light manufacturing that Cuba may be exporting in order for exports to react very rapidly to the devaluation. There may be some limited ability to import substitute, in other words, to produce, for instance, local foodstuffs. But again, the constraint is that there hasn't been enough investment in agriculture. There's a problem with the the system of purchases by the government wholesalers from farmers. There's a lack of foreign finance. The price system is in need of far-reaching reform. Now, market reforms are slowly being introduced, and recently the government opened up a whole array of activities to private persons, but still people are not able to set up private companies. There is no legal recognition of a private entity in Cuba. There's no legal status for a small company. A person can have a little business, but he cannot incorporate or have a partnership or have any kind of legal status. So now this is a very important question, and it's not my expertise. Why are market reforms so slow in Cuba? And this has more to do with the decision-making structure in Cuba, the structure of different interest groups in the government and in the Communist Party. And I'm not a scholar in this area, but people who have studied it have enlightened the view that there are many different interests among these groups, and that this resistance by some elements of the ruling groups slow down reforms. Now, about the economic outlook, the dollar crunch looks set to continue. Tourism may improve a little bit in the second half of this year as the pandemic recedes, and probably there may be some relaxation of U.S. restrictions on things like flights and cruise ships and so forth. But the uncertainty will remain. As I mentioned, reluctance to reform is a very big problem. And the key point is that monetary reform, currency unification, and devaluation will lose effectiveness without more reforms. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis, for your presentation. I will introduce our next speaker. You could stop sharing your screen now.
Yes.
Our next guest, Vadim Grishim, holds
Frank, you're muted. Okay.
Okay, I will introduce our next speaker. Vadim Grishim holds a PhD in social science and an MBA from Georgetown University. After the collapse of the USSR, Dr. Grishim was involved in the reform process in Russia, serving as advisor to the Deputy Prime Minister of the Russian Federation from 1992 through 1993 and 2006 through 2009. Dr. Grishim has experience and have extensive work with Bretton Woods institutions. He was the executive director and board member of the World Bank Group from 2010 through 2014. He has served as a senior advisor at the International Monetary Fund and has taught courses on the economic of transition at Georgetown University and the George Washington University. Thank you for being with us today, Vadim. I give you the word now.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you for the honor of the invitation. Let me share my PPT. The title of my presentation is "The Point of No Return: The Outgoing Cuban Crisis in a Historical Framework." In December 1991, almost 30 years ago, the Soviet Union ceased to exist. It was an unexpected historical event that has still had significant impact on the development of many countries around the world, including Cuba. The remarkable jubilee has stimulated reflections on the legacy and experience of the post-communist transition in Central and Eastern Europe, CEE, and Eurasia, and on their relevance for the current situation unfolding in Cuba, a former Soviet satellite that splintered from the diseased Soviet Empire. There is a prevailing opinion that the CEE countries, as well as the Eurasian states, have mostly completed their post-communist transformation. The results have been quite mixed. Several of them have formed modern democracies with market economies. Some have turned to soft informational authoritarianism and have increased administrative controls over their economies, while other post-Soviet republics, including Russia, have slipped back into tougher authoritarian rule, allowing for state monopolies to play a dominant role in strategic industries, in the process developing system of organized corruption. Cuba seems to have become frozen in this background and is still inching forward with traditional socialist economic cycles, maintaining an old-fashioned repressive political regime. Practically all former socialist countries before deep structural changes have passed through a so-called socialist investment cycle. The standard first step of this cycle is to introduce liberalizing measures as a reaction to slower growth rates or economic crisis. The second is to implement policies that boost economic growth. And the third step is to prevent intensification of macroeconomic imbalances. In its efforts to modernize and update an exhausted socialist economic model, Cuba has been passing through the initial stages of that cycle, facing challenges when it becomes impossible to maintain stability in an economic structure that has not been strengthened with additional reforms. On the whole, these measures have coincided with fundamental elements of Gorbachev economic reforms, which attempt to increase the autonomy of socialist enterprises by converting them to self-financing and self-managing entities, to develop individual and cooperative forms of ownership, to attract foreign capital through joint ventures, as well as unify exchange rates. The differences between these approaches and Cuba's are evident. The island has been moving much more slowly and cautiously, while, as we know, Gorbachev's economic team failed to implement responsible macroeconomic policy and to adopt unpopular but necessary economic decisions, particularly price and tax reforms. Cuba is still between the first and second stages of socialist economic cycle, and its private sector contribution to GDP is below that of the under-reformed countries in the former socialist bloc. Cuba's private sector share is just around 25% of GDP compared to Turkmenistan and Belarus, for example, 30%. Reforms in an authoritarian socialist system, as a rule, have been very difficult to break and have taken place because of two main factors: a shift in political leadership and meaningful changes at the economic level. In the past, cyclical economic development was observed in most socialist countries, which included growing economic difficulties and an ability to do business as usual because of an exhaustion of extensive mobilization activities, which prompt these countries to start modernization reforms using market components. That, as a rule, contributed to a soaring inflation and public debt and resulted in reforms rollbacks and partial return to the standard of a common economy. Such reformist cycles took place in the Soviet Union during the Khrushchev thaw in the late 50s, then during a period of so-called Kosygin reforms in the mid-60s, and finally during Gorbachev perestroika at the end of the 80s. According to available information, Cuba now seems to be drawn into the third reformist cycle. The first one in that country was triggered by the collapse of the Soviet Empire and was quickly paused out in 1995. Opinions vary as to why the attempt at reform after the collapse of the Soviet Union was scrapped in Cuba. There is talk of Fidel Castro's rigid views, his harsh anti-Americanism, and the Cuban leadership realization that they would not be able to contain the situation if a Cuban Tiananmen occurred. This, of course, cannot be ruled out, but there is another important circumstance. Any transformation, whether it is the Eastern European version, Eurasian in the former Soviet Union, or even Chinese, involves not only the creation of market mechanism, but also the inclusion of these countries in the global economy. The presence of an economic powerful and politically influential Cuban community near the island in the United States certainly intimidates Havana. There is an understanding there that the current communist elite would lose virtually all of its position if such active integration were to take place with the inevitable involvement of Cuban Americans. In this case, the effect of a divided nation probably also works. From this point of view, the Cuban situation can be viewed through the prism of the unification of Germany or the unification of North and Southern Vietnam, as well as through the prism of a divided Korea. In the case of Cuba, there is no divided territory, but there is a divided nation. By the way, the unification of Germany and the situation with two Koreas are, well, usually viewed from a different angle: the effectiveness of market institutions and the difference in the development of divided nations. This is certainly an interesting theoretical angle, but in practical terms, it seems what communist elites care about, what may happen to them in the case of integration. They are more concerned not with development, but with their own survival. The second cycle in 2008-2011 was initiated by a partial change in the political leadership, and Silvia already talked about this, with the gradual departure of Fidel Castro from power and the growing influence of his brother Raúl, as well as by pressure brought on during the global financial turmoil at the time. As for the second stage of reforms initiated by Raúl Castro, attracted attention a recent statement made by a close friend of Raúl Castro, former Lieutenant General of the Soviet KGB, Nikolai Leonov. He is 82 years old now. He sees the value of the second cycle of reforms initiated by Raúl primarily in terms of the continuity of power, the rejubilation of leadership, and the change of leadership. According to Leonov, this will allow Cuba to avoid the Belarusian scenario. In general, it should be noted that one of the main issues of socialist-type authoritarianism is the leadership turnover. In the Soviet Union, leadership changes occurred mostly, let's put it in this way, by anthropological reasons, as a result of dearth of communist leaders, Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, or Andropov. Only once there was a bureaucratic coup against Khrushchev, and we remember that Gorbachev left his position as a result of the collapse of the whole system. The current third cycle is linked to a further restructuring of the political hierarchy in Havana, to the implementation of some provisions of new constitution, and to a deep economic crisis induced by the dramatic reduction of subsidies from Venezuela and the delayed arrival of a COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has exposed the vulnerability of the Cuban economy, and the attempt to compensate for the loss of Venezuela's assistance through development of tourism services has proven to be non-sustainable. Decreasing US remittances and raised sanctions have also added pain to the existing economic reality. The country has found itself between a rock and hard place, and once again, an ongoing crisis has prompted a new set of reforms. Paradoxically, after the 1959 revolution, Cuba turned out to be an oil-dependent country. During the Soviet period, a scheme, oil in exchange for sugar, was based on significant subventions and lasted for almost 30 years. In the early 2000s, reforms were pushed back by substantial subsidies from Venezuela. Involuntary parallel with the USSR occurred as well at the end of the 60s, when Kosygин's reforms were abandoned as a result of huge oil fields discoveries in Western Siberia. Cuba, a country without significant oil reserves, turned into a kind of petrostate, critically dependent on oil delivery and distribution of oil revenues, first from the USSR and then from Venezuela. That bonanza period now seems to have come to an end. Reforms pose serious challenges to a socialist regime. Cuba is slowly moving toward high risk and long delay exchange rate unification, and Luis and Silvia already talked about this, with its government preparing to scrap the dollar-pegged convertible peso and significantly devalue the ordinary Cuban peso. Many experts believe that this step will be essential to advancing the island's reform agenda. The official goals of the reform include economic efficiency improvements, growth of productivity, import substitution, and stimulation of exports. It's promised to be a delicate maneuver of putting pressure on inefficient state companies, generating open unemployment, threatening savings, and creating inflation dynamics that will be difficult to control. According to official estimates, the inflation rate will jump to triple-digit numbers, with the World Bank forecast, 140%, with the World Bank forecast being 3 times higher. Timing the arrival of a pandemic with an implementation of reforms was not chosen by chance. It has allowed the government to reduce the risk of major social protests. There are always winners and losers in any reform program. But when it comes to currency unification, the major loser could be an incipient private sector that have been weakened by the collapse of tourist seasons 2020 and 2021, while public companies could be likely receive compensation from the state. Generally here, the Cuban leadership faces a dilemma again, determining what reform path it should take. The Sino-Vietnamese model that maintains socialist rhetoric, strict censorship, mechanism of repression, and a one-party political system has long attracted sympathy in Havana. At the same time, it's obvious that the Sino-Vietnamese model with a 2-track economic transformation, applying quick decollectivization in agriculture and creation of efficient special economic zones that facilitate a shift to export-oriented orientation and intensive integration with global value chains have become hardly acceptable to the Cuban leadership. Yeah, and then the size of the country, the size of population, size does matter. And again, double track transition, when Vietnam and China came from a traditional agricultural society to an industrialized one, and from centralized economy to a so-called socialist market. By comparison, the Eastern European post-communist model that includes both the political component with democratization of political life and an economic one with full liberalization of market forces and various forms of European integration into NATO and the EU do not readily conform to the Cuban reality. There are also models that have been testified in post-Soviet republics, but for different reasons, they have lost their attractiveness in Cuba. The relatively stable and deeply under-reformed Belarusian authoritarian regime that has aroused certain sympathies in Havana has now begun to fall apart in the eyes of the world. A visible constraint that is presently getting in the way of Cuban reforms is the unwillingness on the part of the island's authorities to use the investment capacity of the Cuban community abroad. Co-ethnic communities have provided a meaningful chunk of investment capital that has worked very efficiently during the initial stage of reforms in different countries like Poland, China, Baltic republics, and Vietnam. Of course, at this time, there is a sanctions barrier blocking sizable FDIs to Cuba, and even small-scale investments that could potentially emerge from a multi-billion flow of remittances are being drastically restricted and de facto rejected by official Havana. The very significant scale of Cuban immigration, primarily to the United States, has also created the effect of a divided nation. This is not a replica of the situation that took place in Eastern and Western Germany, or what is taking place now in the Northern and South Koreas. Nevertheless, future reintegration of a part of the Cuban American community into the island's life seems inevitable. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, such reintegration of so-called white immigrants never occurred in Russia, because long years had passed since the Bolshevik Revolution and several generations changes of Russian migrants transpired. In countries where the duration of socialist regimes was relatively short, however, as in the CEE area, for example, partial reintegration of immigrants was successful. But at present, such prospects are perceived by Havana as a threat. From that point of view, systemic anti-American rhetoric on the part of Cuba's government is not only a form of nationalism or a mechanism for distancing itself from a powerful northern neighbor in the interest of a ruling communist elite, but also an instrument for limiting the influence of the Cuban American community on the island. Anti-Americanism remains an important pillar of the current Cuban regime. In turn, the communist Cuba, the theme has long remained a part of the US domestic political agenda. The current arrival of a new democratic administration promises a US policy pivot towards Cuba. Whether that proves to be a turn from Trump era to Obama II era, with a new reset and deterrent will depend on many unpredictable factors. Obviously, part of the Cuban elite is counting on that development as a favorable anti-crisis strategy, while at the same time fearing that process, remembering that the short though between Havana and Washington, which happened at the end of the second term of Obama's administration, was accompanied by unprecedented growth in the popularity of the American president among the Cuban population. An erosion of condensed anti-Americanism could open prospects for deeper structural reforms in the island and remove some restrictive blocks that are in the way of creating a market economy. This is exactly what occurred in a majority of socialist countries during Gorbachev's perestroika period, when for a while President Reagan and British Prime Minister Thatcher became more popular in those countries than most local communist leaders there. It was a turning point, a point of no return. Since there is a little time left, I will briefly address some other topics of the inevitable future post-communist transit in Cuba, using just bullet points. Three main components come into play during such transitions: political, economic, and institutional. Their combination vary in the regions that experience the transitions. My first point is the following: who might be a driving force behind such a shift in Cuba? Many experts believe that it will be mostly the nascent private sector, contrapropistas. That is certainly true, but the European and even Chinese experience show that the middle bureaucracy usually plays an exceptionally important role in such a transition, as this group realizes at some point that it cannot develop, improve the quality of life, and remain stuck in the ceiling. Then the desire for change overweights the fear of losing the stability of the status quo. The second point is ideology. We already talked about this. When we talk about the persistence of communist rhetoric in China and Vietnam, we have to understand that there has been a significant decommunization of society there too. Now in China, they say that Mao Zedong was 70% right and 30% wrong. This 30% has opened up space for the development of private enterprises, personal initiative, decentralization, and many other important components of the Chinese transition. So a further decommunization in Cuba is inevitable. The question is what the communist ideology will be replaced with. Most likely it will be nationalism. However, a key question arises: to what extent will this nationalism will be free from anti-Americanism? Most likely we'll be seeing the soft version. The third point regards the role of leaders. Just a couple of days ago, Gorbachev's 90th birthday was celebrated, and hot debates were reignited in Russia about how much Gorbachev was personally responsible for the collapse of the Soviet Union. Such a question ridiculously simplifies the reality and de facto attributing historical events to one person. Nevertheless, Gorbachev's opponents who have blamed him and his strong supporters who have praised him have agreed that Gorbachev at least hastened the downfall of the socialist system, even if he didn't want to do that. Why is the role of a leader so important in events that involve the change of the system? Because old institutions are no longer working and the new ones have not yet been created. A leader, to a certain extent, replaces institutions and fills an institutional vacuum. It's also important that a leader come from the socialist elites and that he be close to them. This is an important indicator of an elite split and a necessary factor in any transition. Finally, when considering such a transition, we cannot ignore the important aspect of a country's predisposition to producing an oligarchy. Post-communist oligarchic systems are prone to authoritarianism, and an oligarchy is a serious obstacle to building representative democracy and sustainable institutions. Does Cuba have such prerequisites? From my point of view, yes, it does. However, everything will depend on how much the rent aspect of the Cuban economy will be preserved and how quickly and successfully new institutions will be built. In Eastern Europe, due to Euro integration, it has been possible to build new institutions fairly fast that prevent the formation of strong oligarchic groups. Most countries which formed part of the former Soviet Union failed to do that, and their oligarchic structures and economies have had an extremely negative impact on the country's development. And lastly, the question also arises whether Cuba is capable of jumping from a backward socialist totalitarianism to modern forms of authoritarianism, such like informational authoritarianism. Such a leap seems extremely problematic from my point of view. Let me stop here, and I will be glad to continue our discussion and Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vadim. You could stop share the screen.
Sure.
On behalf of the University of Rhode Island and ASCII, I want to thank all the panelists and all the attendees who joined us today. We open now the floor for the Q&A session. If you have any questions, please, you could use the Q&A button at the lower level of the Zoom website. And we will be happy to answer some of your questions. We will start with the first one. That is for Christine Johnson. How should the Biden administration consider these challenges in shaping policy toward Cuba in the coming years? It seems a return to risk in terms of sectoral reliance has some attendance risks. Do you have recommendations for a nuanced policy? Any of our panelists could answer the question. You could
I would
unmute
say
yourself.
Vadim and Luis are good for that question.
Well, it's going to be a difficult task for the Biden administration, because it actually is not only Cuba, but Latin American policy, and particularly the Cuban and Venezuelan aspects of Latin American policy. I think Cuba is tightly connected to Venezuela in terms of the alliance between the two countries and the mutual support. This is an alliance for mutual support, and it provides a difficult element. I think the Biden administration would like to have some influence on Cuba's policy on Venezuela to soften Cuban support for Venezuela's regime. And I think they're trying to formulate a solution to this. I don't really, this is not my area of expertise. And I don't really know what elements they are thinking, but the result is that there's going to be a lot more deliberation about opening some restrictions to Cuba. I think there will be some obvious areas of opening to Cuba because of the nature of them. For instance, regarding tourism visits and regarding the transportation, where there have been cancellations of flights to Cuba. Remittances is an interesting question. This is an area where we economists know very little, because I don't work on this, but it's very difficult to get hard data. And whether the Trump restrictions on remittances have had a major impact or not is not known. Because at the same time, there was a recession in the US that affected remittances. So they've been going down, but it's very difficult to trace them. Of course, I think the regulation regarding Western Union, which cannot operate in Cuba, essentially is one that is likely to be revised. But money flows, and I mean, one aspect of remittances is that some of the money flows because of traveling. People bring dollars physically, and that is a function of the flow of visitors. So that will tend to improve as visitors are able to get more flights and the pandemic recedes. But in terms of policy, I think it's going to be a very deliberative process. But again, I'm not really the right person to be talking about this.
Thank you. Our next question is from Tunden Tendar, and say, given their backgrounds in communism, how is current Cuba similar to or different from China regarding to their citizens, civil and human rights?
Let me take this question. So if we just look at political side of this equilibrium, then the difference exists, but not very significant. But on economic side, the changes are dramatic, or the differences are dramatic, because China is much more open and incentivate economic activities of citizens and regions. It's decentralized, and we see that the market principles, in one way or another, are working there. So, and in case of Cuba, it's this type of interaction in economic field is still an incipient level. So that's why China, from this point of view, economic point of view, is much more open and friendly to citizens of the country.
Yeah, I guess I could say something about, I think immediately what the Biden administration needs to do is to undo some of the sanctions that Donald Trump put in place, and to allow, once again, the free flow of information and goods and travel between Cubans in the island, Cubans in the United States, and in other countries. I think that that's the number one thing that needs to be done, including, restoring the role of Western Union. I mean, it's ridiculous to have closed off the flow of goods and information for people who have family on both sides of the straits, to put it that way. After that, I think that Biden is so busy, I think, with the COVID crises, particularly in this country, and the economic problems of the United States that have resulted from it, that he hasn't yet really been able to formulate much of a foreign policy towards anybody, not just towards Cuba, but towards any other countries. And I think that maybe the immigrants in this country need to be able to reach out to him and his administration with ideas for what he could do. I don't think he wants to just follow upon what Obama did. I think what Obama did was sort of a beginning, as I understand it from people who participated in the reopening of the relations between the two countries, that there was a broader agenda. Okay, for example, I know, and I am that many people in the Cuban exile community mind that relationships were reestablished, but the political prisoners in Cuba were not part of the agenda. Getting them out of prison was not a part of the agenda. People who worked in that process of reestablishment tell me that they were moving in that direction. They just didn't get there because they ran out of time. I don't know, because I wasn't one of them. But I think that there needs to be not just a return to where Obama left things off, but also something that takes into account the human rights record in Cuba, in my view.
The following question is from Joshua Gronske. He is asking, how do the changes in U.S. policy towards Cuba, Obama versus Trump, as an example, influence the willingness of investors and businesses to expand their operation in other countries? Will there be any hesitancy to take advantage of the new market opportunities because of the uncertainty of a new U.S. administration changing policies and restrictions again?
Well, see, I take it the question is about direct investment in Cuba and how it will be affected by changes, possible changes in U.S. policy. Of course, we don't know what these changes are going to be, and it doesn't look like fundamental legal changes in terms of existing legislation, U.S. legislation, is going to happen soon, given the composition of the Congress. But in terms of the overall problem of Cuba trying to get foreign investment, Cuba has been reforming its foreign investment laws. They are actually not the main block. Cuba now allows 100% ownership of an operation of companies. They don't have to be joint ventures. They used to have to be 50% joint ventures with some exceptions. So that has been reformed. There's being a reform of the process and so forth. The problem, of course, is that it is risky to invest in Cuba, and it is risky. I mean, one aspect of it is there's a question of the lack of access to the U.S. market, which will remain as long as legislation that is in place remains in the U.S. But it's risky because of the operating environment in Cuba. It's very risky. There are capital controls, there are currency controls, and there will be for a long time, so that companies have a problem accessing currency to import components and goods and to remit dividends to the parent company and so forth. This actually restricts investment as long as the overall economy is not stabilized. So the answer to the foreign investment question, the simple answer is that they need to stabilize the economy and get it to grow again. And for that, they need to do quite a bit. Now, foreign investment should be a result of that. Now, U.S. restrictions are, of course, a major concern because the national market for Cuba is the U.S. And as long as this market is essentially closed. This restricts the universe of possible investments. But I think before it gets to that point, it needs to have an environment, an economic environment that is stable and that allows company to manage the risk. For instance, the great example is that people don't quite understand that tourism in Cuba, even though there are Spanish companies managing over 80% of the hotels in Cuba, these companies have no capital invested in Cuba. They are just management contracts because, well, they may be affected by US restrictions, but the fact is that it is risky to hold capital in Cuba. So the amounts of foreign investment that flow into Cuba are very small. They're less than 1% of GDP, which are, as a matter of fact, being around 0.5% of GDP even in recent years. And that means that it's a very insignificant amount, even though the Cuban government has been opening up the sector and has created areas like in the Mariel area. There are special rules that allow freer operation of companies. So we've gotten some investments there, but it's essentially at the end of the day, it's going to depend on stabilizing the entire economy and reforming it.
Thank you. The following question from Marco Gonzalez says, one of the factors in the Obama administration efforts to increase interaction with Cuba was the expectation that increased interaction with Cubans would lead to political and economic change in the island. While this experiment did not last long before the Trump administration tightened the restrictions, will it have worked given enough time?
I think Vadim wants to say something.
Vadim, you're muted.
But yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. Great question. Yes, I believe time is relevant. And if we can imagine that such interaction can be longer, and we could see more influence of this positive influence on island's economic growth. That's why I believe that it's important for any policy to have a reasonable time frame. Otherwise, we cannot understand their outcomes. And let me also add to the previous questions regarding future relations or development of the US-Cuban relations. And they depend not only on several factors and not only on reforms which can be developed in the island or human rights agenda, but it also depends on relations between Cuba and Venezuela. And I believe these future relations between two nations, Cuba and Venezuela, and the development of Venezuelan crisis will impact significantly on bilateral relations between the US and Cuba.
Thank you. We have another question that says, to what extent will market reforms and greater Cuban economy integration into the world economy threaten the power and economic interests of the Cuban military? What could change the political calculus for them to become agents supportive of a reform agenda? From Gaston Fernandez.
Okay, I will hazard myself. That's a very difficult question, but I think in countries where the military has played a very important political role for many years, and that's most of Latin America, that if the military divides sometimes in the middle of a process and part of it goes in one direction and part of it goes in another direction, that becomes an important dynamic of the process of social change. And that would be equally true in Cuba or in Venezuela, or in fact, in most Latin American countries. What we don't know is I believe, we don't know what makes them divide as opposed to act as a unified military. But I think in important processes of change, the role of the military and military factions has been very, very important. I wanted to get to another question, if I may, Fran Carlos, from Yvonne Grenier. He said, what would happen if Raúl were to fully retire, you know, and not just sort of be behind the scenes? This is only an intuition and a belief on my part, but I do believe that there is in Cuba a political generation that is behind the generation of the Glorious Revolution that still has the power, the political power in their hands. I think that there is another generation behind them, much younger, of course, the children off very often, but highly educated, who knows the Cuban scene very well, has traveled all over the world, learned a great deal from other situations. And I think that they are there. I can't tell you who they are with name and number because we don't know them, and much less from a distance. But I believe that they're there and that they can be counted upon to take on the reins of a process of change in a democratic direction, I believe.
Let me add just a few words. Very interesting and important question. We have in Cuba personalized regime in one way or another. That's why the change of the leadership is very, very critically important. And we could see it in other so-called socialist countries, even in the Soviet Union. The change of Stalin to Khrushchev, Khrushchev to Brezhnev, Brezhnev to Gorbachev, it was a significant, dramatic change in the country's development. So the same here. I believe that we can see this trace, we can see this development. I agree with Silvia that we are talking about generational change, and generational change is even much more important for political development than just simple change of the personality of the leader. And a couple of words regarding involvement of military leadership in political and economic development of the island. It's again, it's the challenging balance between the intention to control the situation and to develop economy and country. When this balance will be changed and those groups of military which are involved in economic activity will understand better that their share of pie increase much more significantly if they change this balance in favor of development, then we will see their division and involvement in and changes in the island.
We only have a couple of more minutes, so we will try to finish to answer some of the questions that have been posed. From Hillary Stuck, the result of the loss of fertilizer products coming from Russia mean Cuba became an example of the peak oil scenario, and I was wondering if Cuba could take advantage of their crops, which are now produced organically.
I strongly believe that, yes, it's very important that Cuba can be in this niche of organic production of agricultural products, no doubts. And it's a unique opportunity. And there are some other opportunities. We already talked about this in IT sector and medical segment and some others. It's not only about traditional constrained interaction between two countries, I mean, the US and Cuba in an economic field.
Well, I was going to add that agriculture is a problem because essentially the way the system operates now, it's very difficult for private farmers to have a profitable operation, and there is a state monopoly of purchases and input provisions of input supply of inputs to farmers that makes it very difficult. There are also now a new development with the new changes is that there's a whole array now of top prices for agricultural goods that are implemented now supposedly in aiming at making a more flexible system. These new price controls are operated at the municipal level, so that that town councils can set prices, top prices in different regions, different cities. So what really is happening is that that farmers have prices that are essentially below the cost of production. So the question is, how do you grow anything if you cannot have the conditions for an operation that is profitable? And I think that this is one of the most difficult areas that Cuba needs massive reform, but it involves quite a bit more. Now, going from this, I'm going to make the jump to the role of the state companies, because it is very important. Now, the military, a section of the military manages some of these state companies. And these are essentially involved in the export sector, either in tourism or in other aspects where there is dollar revenue, mostly related to tourism. And the problem with the system is that these are other state companies. There's no competition. I mean, there could be competition among them, but they're really monopolies. And one of the problems is that the economy in Cuba doesn't have any way to allocate resources efficiently, and it needs to instill competition. Now, this is related to the question of control, because as long as you have a sector, and a lot of this is within the military, that controls all the hard currency earning state companies, then they have a vested interest to keep the monopoly. And I mean, there is a way to reform where you can have competition, but there also has to be, of course, a growth in the private sector that is competitive. And right now, that is essentially just tiny micro enterprises, because there's no way for them to grow. As a matter of fact, there are even taxes that increase as the labor, as employment increases in these small companies. So, I mean, the reforms have to go into creating a more competitive economy, so that you can begin to have a system that allocates resources better, and farmers can grow whatever they want, organically or not organically. But I think right now they are not moving very fast on this. And why is that? Again, because there are different sectors that have different interests within the ruling elite, and these sectors essentially create bottlenecks in the decision-making process. So they are talking about moving a little bit to some role for markets, but there is very little role except the black markets. The black markets are everywhere in Cuba. They really they are illegal. You cannot buy and sell dollars. You cannot practice journalism, for instance, in Cuba. As an independent journalist, it's illegal. There's still a lot of activities that are illegal, and but it's a market the same for essential foodstuffs. You can buy them in the parallel market, in the black market. And these are repressed, and they're repressed by having top prices, let's say. Sometimes they're not enforced, sometimes they're enforced. There's always the risk they're going to be enforced, so that restrains the supply of these goods, which are necessary. And by restraining the supply, that increases even the price more in the black market. So it essentially makes it even more difficult for everyone. So now, why isn't this reformed? Well, obviously, there are a lot of considerations in the way that decisions are made, and that it's something that that is not transparent. In other words, we don't really understand. I certainly don't, and I think people who have studied it have had a difficult time understanding the decision-making process within the ruling elite.
We only have time for one more question, and will be from David Desert. What is Cuba doing to get their population vaccinated against the virus?
If I can take it, I just emailed with family and friends, and they tell me that they're trying to develop their own vaccine, and that they should have 3 vaccines in May or June. This is what they have been told, but there's nothing definite yet. You know, that is one area in which maybe the US government could do try to make for a rapprochement if it's somehow, not just to give Cuba the vaccine, because that doesn't have the right, spirit to it. But if some of the people from the United States could work together with some of the people who are working in Cuba on the vaccine and make like a joint team or something like that, it could be a very important gesture of goodwill.
Let me briefly add just that there is negotiations between Moscow and Havana about Russian vaccine, and Russia already delivered vaccine to Venezuela, to Argentina, and some other Latin American countries. Though, let's see, we can't exclude that Russian vaccine will be available in Cuba in foreseeable future. So, thank you.
Yes, for the information that I also have, Cuba is the only Latin American country developing a vaccine right now. In the last stages, I read recently that they are beginning phase 3 of one of the candidates of vaccines they have. I think they have 4 different candidates for vaccine. The phase 3 will be starting pretty soon with different populations to check the effectivity of the vaccine. And as Silvia mentioned, they hope by the middle through the end of the year have the complete population of Cuba back with the vaccine for COVID-19 produced by their own Cuban laboratories. I want to thank this excellent panel for their support, for our presentations, the University of Rhode Island, to give us this space and opportunity of interactions about the Cuban crisis, so we could talk about the sociological point of view and the economical point of view of the different crises that have been passing through Cuba for the last couple of years. And with that, I will pass it to Ashley for the final words. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. I think you about covered it. I'd really like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank our attendees for coming to our event. This has been a very enlightening couple of hours. So we really do appreciate everything that you brought to us today during this panel. So thank you very much. I will stop the recording, and I hope everyone has a great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for
Thank you
inviting.
very much.